5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Here in our plush but not overly ostentatious studio, that was Norm Nathan's tagline many years ago, we bring you the Long Hill Report, and we are lucky to have Gus Steeves speaking with us.
Okay.
I'm your host, Richard Morchoe, and the world has changed.
In a few weird ways. Yes.
In a few weird ways. The largest land war in Europe has broken out.
Well, the largest land war in the last
Since
50
World War
years or
since
so.
World War II.
Yeah.
Since World War II.
Yeah.
And the world is now a different place. We are wondering about even the possibility of nuclear war. We hear madmen such as Lindsey Graham saying, "Oh yeah, what about a no-fly zone? No-fly zone of a nuclear war, against a nuclear power." Not probably the greatest idea in the history of humanity.
No, I think it's a good idea. That would be, we should probably be going down to Washington carrying a few extra straitjackets. Because these people need to be taken out of their offices and put in padded cells for their safety and ours.
Well, yeah. If we, there's a lot said about the January 6th. Was it an insurrection? Was it a riot? What was it? Well, the mainstream media want to call it an insurrection.
Yeah.
It
really wasn't much of anything.
It wasn't much of anything. But
Typical propaganda in our country, though, isn't it? Let's
yeah.
blow it all out of proportion. It's distracting, freak everybody out for a while.
Yeah.
And then we'll change the subject, and every once in a while, bring it back again, and we'll bounce over to this subject and freak people out about that for a while, and we'll freak people out about this for a while.
But you remember one thing they did there, and they did it again for the State of the Union speech, is they put the fence around it. Well, they should lock that fence and not let them out.
No, it's true.
That would be kind of a solution to the problem.
Well, we should treat the fence exactly like you treat chickens. You put a big fence over the top too, so they can't climb out either. So,
Look, and none of these guys would be able to figure out how to fly over. And if they got injured trying to do a pole vault, well, no, what kind of loss is that?
not much of one.
But it's a war that has broken out that you could say it started in 1914 because it's kind of a continuation of World War I in many ways. But
In some respects.
it's also a continuation of events at the end of World War II, but more a continuation of events after the Soviets left Germany, when we promised them we would not move NATO 1 inch eastwards.
Right.
And we
Been
did.
a lot of inches since then.
And we didn't. We moved it millions of inches east. We had a whole passel of buffer states between us or NATO, which I don't think is us, but we think our government does.
Well, it is primarily us. I mean, look at how much, when it comes to military elements of it, we are significantly dominant.
That's true. But
And none of the other countries, except maybe Britain and France, have, and maybe Poland does too, and Turkey. But none of the others even have enough power to control their own populations if they had real issues.
Yeah.
And ironically, some of those concerns, specifically Poland and Turkey, are historical issues that we're seeing cropping up on the sidelines of the Ukraine situation.
Plus ça change, plus la même chose. The more things change, the more they remain the same.
Sure. Sure. But those are histories that unfortunately a lot of our policymakers don't bother to learn. Maybe they used to, back when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, but since then, they've basically jettisoned most of the policymakers that know anything about history anywhere else in the world, including ours, actually. But, so you've got situations like the Ukraine being owned originally for several centuries. They were owned by Poland.
certainly
For
a-
several
a
centuries,
century,
chunks of it were owned, like the Crimea specifically, was owned by Turkey.
Yeah.
And the Russians came in and have been in the Crimea since 1783, I think it is, or somewhere right around there. Almost as long as we've existed as a country.
True. But the current situation, basically it comes out of, we promised we wouldn't go, but we've been expanding it. And why wouldn't Russia be concerned about it?
Of course they would.
Now, in 2014, we did a dirty deed in Ukraine. We had the government, elected government, not popular, a very corrupt government, but we had them rioted out. And this is on tape. You can see it on YouTube. Undersecretary Victoria Nuland and Ambassador Payat, or Piat, whatever his name is, planned getting rid of the Yanukovych government, and they put in Yatsenyuk to be the head of the Ukrainian government.
Who was just as corrupt as Yanukovych was.
It was, and then they eventually had an election and said, "Oh, we're democracy now."
Yeah.
And it continued to be a corruptocracy, to be more accurate. So that is the situation that, and Putin kept saying, we have Russian areas here. Federalize it, treat them right. Everybody's happy, don't go into NATO. Oh, we'd like to be in NATO. So you want the right to put missiles right next to us?
Yeah.
We can't have that for the same reason you don't want us putting missiles back in Cuba.
Or Mexico or Quebec or any of these other places that right near us. Yeah.
Nobody answered the question.
Of course not.
Nobody answered the question. Why are we doing that? And nobody's answering the question now. It's just Putin bad.
Right, exactly.
Russia bad. Putin bad. Russia bad. Nobody's answering the questions.
They're not. They don't want us to think when it comes to those issues.
They don't want anybody.
They don't want us to know what the history actually is.
No, of course not.
Even though there's plenty of evidence to show what it is and where it's going, and the risks. I mean, you've probably heard of the precautionary principle, right?
Yes.
Where, just for explanation, obviously, and have you read Nicholas Taleb? Or I think his first name Nassim, actually, but I've
heard that.
He's a theorist. He wrote The Black Swan.
Yeah.
And several other books. And one of the key principles that he argues, and the basic principle of the precautionary principle, is that if you have an issue like this case, like with nuclear war, or some of the other major issues that we're dealing with right now, if you have an issue that has a potential to be existentially catastrophic, you need to do everything you possibly can to eliminate it. Because as long as you have even a small percentage of it happening, eventually in enough time it will happen. That's what statistics do.
Exactly.
And we've been playing dice with nuclear weapons for 70, 80 years now. We can't keep rolling the dice anymore. We can't. About one of these days, we're going to get snake eyes.
I would say that sounds true, and I agree with it. But right now, we got the situation as it is.
Yeah. Right.
And as I mentioned to Mike, I am chairman, chief executive officer, and only member of the U.S. Neutralist Association.
So you're a janitor too.
What?
You're a janitor too.
Well, we're trying. That's the first position we will hire for.
That's the least fun one.
Anyway, so I obviously believe we should get out of NATO.
Yeah.
We should bring all the troops and Navy home, Air Force home. We don't need to be there. We have the Monroe Doctrine. We have two oceans, and a weak neighbor to the north, a weak neighbor to the south. We don't have to be overseas. I believe that World War I was a big mistake.
It was, absolutely.
And World War II, well, we can argue that. I have to say, probably that was a mistake too, but okay. Well, what about Pearl Harbor?
Well, without World War I, they wouldn't have been World
Yeah,
War II.
without World War One, Hitler would have gone to his death raving in a barbarian old soldiers' home.
Well, if it weren't for World War I, he probably would have been an obscure,
Like I say,
if even noticed, architect
right.
or our bad artist. That's what he was.
Oh well, actually, with our getting into World War One,
Yeah.
So we should have not got into World War One. But all right, so say we could argue World War II. Okay, Pearl Harbor. If we hadn't pushed and sanctioned Japan, and everybody who believes these sanctions are a great idea, we sanctioned Japan until they attacked us.
Yeah, basically. And that's exactly what's happening with places like Iran and Russia.
Yeah.
And, I mean, the sanctions are getting to the point of ridiculousness. I was seeing something online just a couple of days ago. They're even sanctioning cats that are participating in contests from Russia. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Having the Munich Symphony Orchestra conductor fired because he was Russian.
That's ridiculous.
And he didn't condemn Putin. Is that not a fascistic act?
Totally, absolutely, totally.
But of course, that was in Germany, and they've never had a history of fascism, so they might not.
They've never had a history of invading Russia either. Oh wait, yes they have.
So anyway, what we're going to do now is we have a situation, and as it is, we have Russian troops in Ukraine, and we have sanctions against Russia. We're going to give Gus his chance to predict what he thinks is going to happen and what he hopes is going to happen.
And what I hope doesn't happen.
And what he
Okay, what do I think is going to happen? I would suspect that, let's put it this way, I think that what our people, despite all of the rhetoric and propaganda and nonsense that our government spouts, I think it will probably stay out of Ukraine. However, it will probably try to do everything it can to arm an insurgency in Ukraine. There are forces both within our government and in the EU and NATO states in Europe that want us to do things like truck weapons into the Ukraine and even give them jets, which I think was proposed by Joseph Borrell, but was almost immediately shot down as stupid because it is. And worse, obviously, you've got the proposal to create a no-fly zone over parts of Ukraine, which is profoundly insane.
Is ipso facto an evidence of your lack of mental faculties?
Pretty much. Because the Russians already have it for all effective purposes. I mean, if we stay out of it, as we should, the Russians are going to win the war. I mean, the Ukrainians don't have a chance. But the problem is our getting involved in it either with mercenaries or sending weapons is just going to make it bloodier. And tick off the Russian bear, who's already ticked off. So especially with the whole issue of sanctions and all this other stuff that's going on now, we seem to be doing everything exactly the opposite of what we should be doing, which is promoting diplomacy and détente. We're doing everything we can to undercut both of those, because we've got diplomats that don't know the meaning of the word diplomacy. And so where does that lead? In the short term, I hope it just means that the war comes to an end, that Moscow and Kiev, they've already started negotiating. Exactly what they're negotiating over is still kind of unclear. Where that's going to go is still kind of unclear. I suspect that the Russians would really not have that much of a concern with the Ukrainian president staying there, provided he does what they tell him to do. And provided he doesn't continue to make efforts to get into NATO and or to support the the entities that exist already in the Ukrainian populace that are basically Nazi, because they are there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they're all over Eastern Europe.
The Azov battalion is definitely
Among them, yes. And
which is funded by a Jewish oligarch, which boggles your mind.
it's all about money. That's part of the problem. But problem is, it's also funded. They're also partially funded and trained by us, and several other countries, and that's part of the problem. Is that there's so many people with fingers in this pie here that I know I don't want to eat it. You probably don't either. I suspect that's probably where it's going to go. It really does scare me, the idea that we are, I mean, as you know, from like 2 years ago, the doomsday clock was pushed to 100 seconds. In reality, we're probably at about 20 seconds. Right now.
I hope you're wrong.
I hope I'm wrong too. and I don't like having that narrow a window by any means. Because one of the things I was looking up, you've heard of Joe Cirincione, right?
Yes.
I may not be pronouncing his name right. He pointed out, as he put it, that there are three major threats to civilization. He was talking to Scott Horton about a week ago. Climate change can do it over decades. Pandemics can kill millions in years. And nuclear weapons can destroy humanity in an afternoon. And there's more than enough of them in both our arsenals and the Russians to do that easily, despite the fact that they're much smaller than they were in the 1980s. And that must be avoided. Is it potentially possible? Yes. I wouldn't be able to calculate a number, but we must avoid it.
No, come on. Nuclear bombs, what's that among friends? You know? I mean, I'd be positively going. Anyway, enough of that. All right, I'll go with my prediction.
Well, we're far enough away from ground zero is probably not to get hit.
You cannot be too
But
far. Yeah.
the aftermath would be awful.
I'll go with what I think is going to happen. First of all, you know who Colonel McGregor is. He was, I believe he was Colin Powell's chief of staff, or his aide, or whatever. Might say guy who kept calling Powell straight.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, he's pretty tied in with Intel.
Okay.
He says it's basically over. You know, in Russian military doctrine, what a cauldron is?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. He said basically all the main Ukrainian formations have been cauldronized.
Mostly toward the Donbass, yeah. I see that.
So that the war is over there. They could, if the Ukrainians could probably keep a guerrilla investment going. That's the danger. If they could if we could sort of stir that pot and make sure that they're supplied just enough, the hell with the population, let's keep that guerrilla warfare going for a decade or two, and we got it. I tend to think Putin knows what he's doing to Chechenize Ukraine. And the negotiations, I am hoping, will lead to an agreement, no NATO, autonomy, at least autonomy for the Donbass states. I think that's absolutely probable? No, I'm absolutely probable is not absolute. But do I think that's probable? It's a good probability.
Yeah.
Do I think it's going to happen? In my case, it's a fingers crossed thing, because it's the sanest thing to do.
Yeah, basically.
But I think that the U.S. in NATO is a very harmful situation for world peace. I think we need to get out of NATO. And I think though I have no way of growing it, the world needs the U.S. Neutralist Association, or the Neutralist Association of the United States.
Right.
We haven't really worked that out. So optimistic? No. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I can totally understand that. It's kind of almost cautiously pessimistic.
Cautiously pessimistic.
Optimistically pessimistic? I don't know how to describe it. Because I can easily see some of the players that are involved here. I mean, we're seeing it from so many different places, whether it be Turkey or Poland or Britain, primarily the U.S. and Britain, doing so much rhetoric. The problem is that's all they know is rhetoric. So maybe that's a plus, that all they can do is spout, but so many of them have no capacity to actually do. Maybe that's a plus for the rest of the world. And maybe that's what the Russians are starting to realize, that we've seen so many years of failed wars after failed wars and interventions and sanctions on various countries, and get to the point where even our imposition of sanctions isn't effective because they create so many ways for. A perfect example is the sanction on Russian banks. However, there's a giant carve out for sending gas and oil to Europe. In other words, the vast majority of the money that flows through the banks is gas and oil money.
I read today the SWIFT.
It's ridiculous.
The SWIFT
doesn't work that way.
The SWIFT protocol has lots of holes in it.
Oh, it does. Absolutely.
Yeah,
one of the biggest holes is the fact that it just pushes them into greater collaboration with the Chinese.
Yeah.
I know you were talking to Mike before I came in, or when I came in, before this show, and how he was saying that he doesn't think that the Chinese are going to go really much of anywhere. I suspect that China knows what it means to both be on the bottom and on the top.
Oh yeah.
Over the course of 5,000 years, they play the long game.
Yeah.
And they're doing it in Africa and South America and various other parts of the world, slowly and gradually trying to just build up their soft power, which is what we used to do.
It's the trade networks.
And it works.
And they're doing it. We'll see if it works, but it looks like the plan is. It certainly looks like a good plan.
Yeah.
But it's a long haul from Africa to South America through East Asia, through the Silk Road type thing, Belt and Road. Mm-hmm. So can they do it?
They have a lot of work to do. There's no question about it.
One thing they are probably thinking of doing, and are probably doing, is trying to conciliate India.
Yeah.
And we're trying to get India to be a thorn in their side.
Yep.
We'll see how that plays out.
Well, one of the things that they were talking about just recently, I think I was reading it this morning, was that our government wants to sanction the Indian government because of their trade ties and specifically their military purchases from Russia. Despite the fact that it completely ignores, and I think part of it was also their agricultural ties to Russia, some of that, which completely ignores the fact that India is more dependent on things like agricultural, like pesticides, not pesticides, and fertilizers and stuff that Russia can provide that we can't provide. And I don't know if China can either. But certainly the Russians are doing it, and they have a direct line to them and have done it for years. So they have every reason to just ignore us because they need the stuff.
Yeah. Calories would worry the Indian subcontinent.
Oh, absolutely.
Far more than Putin being in Ukraine.
Oh, totally.
And economists have been saying, well, you can expect food prices to rise because we're going to have less food fertilizer. And people don't realize how dependent they are on their calories.
Absolutely.
And the calories come out from the earth.
Right.
I don't know if you've ever heard of the book Plowman's Folly.
I have not.
Okay. People are saying, well, maybe there was never an end to the Roman Empire because certain things continued.
Okay.
And a lot of it was continued, and basically there were successor states, but it was still the Roman Empire. It continued on. Well, I almost bought that until I thought back to reading Plowman's Folly. It's a book that says the plow is not a good idea. Now, you can argue that. I'm not going to argue that point.
Okay.
But if I remember it correctly, it said that because of the Roman Empire collapsing, food production in Western Europe went down the tubes.
Okay.
It basically stopped. And over a few centuries until, not the Renaissance, but the Middle Ages really started, the Dark Ages basically ended. Because that food production, the fields were out of production, they gained back fertility.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now the proof of that
Makes sense,
was the other thing, that actually Ireland, because its regime never ended,
Right.
because it wasn't in the Roman Empire, so it didn't collapse.
Right.
Food production declined over the centuries because of that. That basically tells you how important to civilization food is. If you do not have food production,
Oh, of course, by
you won't
definition.
have a civilization. And that, the Plowman's Plow, I've heard the term, the plow is the primary implement of civilization.
Okay.
Plowman's Folly basically says it's a bad idea. You should use different ways of cultivation. That's arguable, but the point about how important fertilizer is, and how we are going to not have as much of it because we're on the outs with Russia.
Well, we already don't.
Yeah.
We already see that issue among our agricultural sector, because we're seeing our fields, our major fields, becoming less nutrient dense. Our crops have been dropping for some time now.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly when it started, but it's been an issue for quite a while now. And when you've got the world right now, you've got the Ukrainian and some of the Russian fields that are basically offline because of the war, to the tune of 25% of the world's wheat crop, and some of the world's corn crop. We can't make up that difference.
No. And
I mean, we could theoretically make up a fair amount of it if we took a lot of the crops that we currently grow for ethanol production and put them back into food, like we probably should be.
That ethanol was a big joke.
It was a scam.
It was absolutely scam.
It was all
because what did they do to distill the crops into ethanol? They used coal
exactly.
to do the distilling.
Right.
Oh, I mean, and nobody says anything. But nobody says anything.
Yeah.
Well, I understand that a bit, because, say, Joe Blow goes out to his job in a factory, if we had any factories left, or Mrs. Joe Blow, or Ms. Joe Blow. They go out to work every day. They come home tired. They're not going to micro study in detail the situation of the world.
Right.
I'm a history nerd.
Right.
That's why I look at this.
Right.
Yeah. But as I probably have pointed out in one of our discussions, the words of Marcus Tullius Cicero, a person who does not know of events before his own time remains ever a child. How do you have a so-called our democracy without a really a citizenry who can really think about this?
That's part of the
And it
problem.
scares me.
And that's exactly what corporate interests in our country don't want.
Oh,
Is a citizenry that can contradict them.
but they don't have to worry, even if they were not pulling their games. I mean, they would have to worry about having actually an honest media. That's the only thing that
That would be an important change in the right direction. And unfortunately, I mean, as you know, I'm in the media at the local level, and it's really kind of saddens me to see where the mainstream media in this country has gone over the years.
Was it not always the same?
I don't think it was anywhere near this bad. I mean,
You don't think it was-
the giant corporate media has always been corporate, and to some degree, you can't get away from that when you've got a media system where their survival depends on profits, as opposed to a system where it should be there and survive based on the service that it provides to the public. But the catch-22 of that, of course, is that obviously it needs money to survive, to run on, and you can have publicly owned media, which is typically government-owned media, that can be just as propagandistic as corporate media is.
I'm
for
shocked.
slightly different reasons, but it ends up being just as bad.
I'm shocked that you say this. You know I'm shocked.
I can see you're totally shocked. But I think since the Cold War formally ended, I don't think it ever actually ended.
No.
But since it formally ended, our media has taken on the coloration and the attitudes that Pravda in the Soviet Union of the 1980s took on.
Oh, yeah.
Although they do it, our government does it, our media does it mostly because it sells, as opposed to to a lesser degree because of the ideology that's behind it. Our government has become much more ideological over the years. It always was to a certain degree, but it's become really blatantly, badly ideological as the years have gone on.
Well, it's a managerial state, as Burnham called it, and Orwell stole it for, 1984.
Yeah.
And its ideology is really power.
Yeah.
So, it's not like it's saying, it goes into the wokeism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's the ideology du jour. And when people realize that that's dumb, then they will come up with some other ideology du jour to maintain their power. Because that's what they do. We are run by
the woke era. It seems to be, to me, if they can, I don't say they can't do it, but if they can come up with something worse than wokeism, I will say it's brilliant. I will just throw up my hands and say, that's it. Ladies and gentlemen.
Maybe that's why they're getting all stressed out now with the whole Russia thing.
Yeah.
They realize that everything is
COVID season is over. COVID season is over. Ukraine, its season is in.
At the moment. Which is exactly why we're doing this.
Okay, let me point that out before we just go, ladies and gentlemen.
We are trying to get people involved. If you're watching, obviously we're in Southbridge. He's not, but Maureen and I are. And we're trying to get people involved in protesting the wars. And I'm not so much on one side or the other. I just think the war itself is ridiculous. And we, as a country, need to be out of it.
Yes, I'm not for Russia or Ukraine.
It's against
us out.
We need to be out. We need to be doing what we can to promote diplomacy between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Get back to being a country that is actually treats other countries fairly and treats them and goes into dealings with other countries like we actually know something about them, which means doing some history, doing some homework. Stop sending in ideological knuckleheads like Blinken to be our quote-unquote diplomats when I don't think this guy could diplomatize, if that's a word, his way out of a bag.
Well, I have a theory about Blinken. If you told him, instead of telling him, go over and find a diplomatic solution, if you said to him, go over and find a non-diplomatic situation that stirs the cauldron, well, he might fail at that.
He's good at that.
He might fail at that, and then we'd have peace. But that's ridiculous. I'm just going to, as also,
flip it around. Upside down.
Call for a foreign policy that does not seek war, and it does not search for monsters to destroy.
Absolutely, because we tend to create the monsters that we end up having to destroy, or we think we have to destroy. Unfortunately, some of them are running our country. So,
ladies and gentlemen, come back next month where we again save the world.
We're trying anyway. And so anyway, if you're interested, we get together on Saturdays at noon at the Rotary in Southbridge.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much.